Hi everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to be looking at the birth chart of Rachel Zegler. Rachel was born on May 3rd in 2001, making her a Taurus. Her big three are Taurus Sun, Cancer Rising, and Virgo Moon. Now I feel like this is actually like a fairly wholesome big three. So it's interesting to me to see that she does get quite a lot of like criticism for the way that she appears, the way that she acts and whatnot. And we'll get into why I think that could be the case. So starting off strong, her ascendant is in the sign of Cancer, meaning that she has a lunar ruled birth chart. The moon is her chart ruler. It's the most significant planet within her natal chart. And people with their ascendants in Cancer, they're often very self-protective and they're very sensitive, right? So Cancers kind of have this thing, Cancer rising people, they want to sort of prevent themselves from experiencing hurt or pain, and that's kind of why they develop this sort of like thick outer shell, right? Think of a crab, right? Cancer is associated with crabs, and crabs have a very thick outer shell, but a very soft, very vulnerable inside, right? And so people with Cancer placements, or like Rachel, who is a Cancer rising, often exhibit this trait. But the self-protective tendency of people with Cancer placements, or Cancer rising people in this case, is that it can come across as kind of like defensive almost and passive aggressive to some extent, right? And I think that this could kind of be why she gets maybe such like a bad reputation, or she just doesn't come across quite as well. I think that could be the case. I think that people can sense that. But what's interesting to me too here is that the ascendant is forming a sextile to the sun. So even though she's like tends to be more like internal and kind of protective of herself, she also isn't afraid to like express her personality necessarily, right? I think overall with her ascendant, I'm getting the vibe that she's sort of like, when it comes to her public persona, her public perception, I think she's more private and protective. But I think like with her friends, with people that she's close to, I do think she's a lot more outgoing and a lot more like extroverted, if that makes sense. Rachel's sun is in Taurus in the 11th house. People with Taurus suns, like Rachel, their core purpose in life typically revolves around creating like a stable base for themselves, right? And they tend to kind of get a lot of vitality and like energy from like engaging with the material world. So with nature, with like doing sensory things like creating art, painting, that sort of thing, as well as of course the material type of stuff, having to do with money. Tauruses are very much renowned for their love of money, so there is that, certainly. I do really love her sun being in the 11th house. The 11th house is such like an underrated house. It's very sweet. The 11th house is the house of friends, hopes, and wishes. And with her sun here, I do really think that she has like a very steady, stable friend group, or maybe that's something that she is working on cultivating, like a very devoted sort of group of friends, right? I do also think that she's likable. Like, I think that other people want to be her friend. And I think that people kind of naturally tend to gravitate towards her. I think she's got like a very grounding presence, and I think people like that, right? Interestingly, her sun is forming a square to Neptune, so this is like a tense aspect. And the sun is said to kind of represent like more so conscious experience. Neptune is sort of the unconscious things, or like the things having to do with like dreams and like things that kind of like what's the word I'm looking for here? Things that like extend beyond the material planes into the immaterial and like spiritual stuff, right? So it's very interesting. I think her conscious reality, therefore, to some extent, kind of conflicts with her dreamscape almost. Like, I think that she's a very like, there's just like this disconnect between waking life and the realm of like her aspirations, right? So I think that in like her real waking daily life, I think that she's very much focused on like again, the material world, cultivating a stable base, a stable sense of security for herself, building up her finances, building up her like friend group, right? It's very like practical, it's very steady, it's very stable, it's very engaged with like the actual physical world. But on the other hand, you know, I do think that there's kind of like this desire or this dream of like sort of like I think she wants to build like a radical community almost. Like there's sort of this sense of like breaking free from things maybe. And that's because her Neptune is in Aquarius, of course. It's also in the 8th house too. So I do think that maybe, I don't know, Neptune in the 8th house, like anytime I see 8th house or 12th house placements, which she has come up in a reading, I always think that there's something like mentally going on, you know, like mental health related. You know, like maybe like the 8th house especially is like associated with death and like endings. So I don't know, I do think there's a strong draw for her towards like spiritual matters and sort of the occult and whatnot. She does give me a little bit of that energy, you know. I do wonder too with Sun square Neptune, it also gives me the vibe of like someone who like dissociates almost. Like there's a lot of like daydreaming, there's a lot of like cloudiness going on, right? And I think she usually, I think she almost wants to appear very grounded, but I do think she has these moments where she's kind of like dissociating and like going off somewhere else almost. That's kind of what the vibe it gives me. I also too think with this aspect, as with some other things in her natal chart, which we'll get into later, I do think that it almost seems to me like she might be like a Jane Fonda sort of like actor. Like I can see her kind of turning more into activism, especially as she gets older, like, you know, that sort of like actor turn activist archetype, right? So I do think it'll be like kind of interesting to like see where she goes in her career and if she'll like stay committed to this role as an actor or if she'll take on like other hats, you know? So she has her moon in Virgo. Moon in Virgo people tend to feel really safe and secure through the process of like organizing things, and it's like very emotionally logical almost, right? I think she's very good at articulating her emotions, expressing how she feels. Maybe she's someone that likes to like write down how she feels, like journaling and stuff, right? At the same time though, with Moon and Virgo people, I always see this tendency to like over intellectualize their emotions. So she's probably someone who's very good at, again, speaking on her emotions, speaking about her emotions, but there might not necessarily be a sense of embodiment for her. Like there might be just like an inability to kind of like feel your feelings as opposed to just like thinking about your feelings, you know, that sort of thing. And there are also too, with the Moon and Virgo people, there's always this kind of tendency to like want to like perfect your emotional expression with the Moon and Virgo. Like it's wanting to just articulate your emotions correctly. Like there's this obsession with like getting across your emotions in a manner that's correct, right? Which can impede like the actual genuine expression of emotion, because emotions are not, you can't really perfect the expression of an emotion. An emotion just like comes up as something like dynamic and it's just like very genuine, right? So you don't necessarily want to be like nitpicking yourself and like beating yourself up over like not expressing an emotional state correctly, you know? Like it's sort of like cliche to say, but like it's okay to feel what you feel when you feel it. That's what I always try to tell people with like a Virgo moon. It's like your feelings are valid no matter like what you feel, and you don't have to like be such a perfectionist about your emotions, right? Her moon is also forming a trine to Mercury. Mercury is also the planet of communication. Mercury also is the ruler of Virgo. So this kind of just reaffirms what I've been saying like this entire time about like her ability to like express her emotions and like talk about her emotions and like this kind of intellectualizing that she gets into. I I do think she would make like a good therapist. Like I do tend to see like a lot of therapists with these placements, because therapy is all about talking about like your feelings. Like that's kind of the thing with therapy, right? I do wonder if she's like the therapist of her friend group, you know? Like I see this a lot with people in Moon and Virgo, or just people that have like a lot of Virgo placements. It's like they're like the designated therapist, right? In their group of friends, and then all the friends go to like this Virgo moon person to like talk about their feelings and stuff, you know? So that's something to keep in mind. That can also be very exhausting too, right? If you're like the therapist of your friend group and like everyone's coming to you with their issues, it's like who's gonna be like your shoulder to cry on, so to speak, right? Like who are you gonna go to with all your issues if you're kind of taking care of everyone else's feelings, you know? And finally, it's also a third house moon, right? So again, that just reaffirms what I've been saying. It's like just like so much, like there's so much like analytical potential with this, right? I think that it's probably really good for her acting though. Like I think she's very like meticulous about kind of thinking about her character's mental state and like emotional state, and like she's very good at like articulating that. Like I think it definitely like benefits her in an acting sense, you know? Yeah. She has her Mercury in Taurus. Mercury in Taurus people communicate in a really grounded and steady manner. It also makes me think that she's pretty like level-headed, and she's not super like dramatic about things. I think she's probably good at like conflict resolution and like de-escalation and that sort of thing. With a Mercury in Taurus, generally these people tend to have like sort of like slower thoughts almost. Like they're not as good at picking up on new concepts, right? Like they need time to like sit with things and like mull things over, and their minds aren't necessarily as quick. That's not to say they aren't clever necessarily, but it takes them time to learn new skills, right? I do also have to wonder if she has like if she's on fairly, if she has siblings even. I don't even know if she does. But it doesn't make me think that maybe she's on fairly good terms with her siblings, or they get along pretty well, right? They're pretty close, that sort of thing too. Another thing I will say when looking at this Mercury in Taurus is that it's forming a square to Uranus in Aquarius, right? So again, she is very like level-headed. She is very grounded typically, but I do also think that there might be as well, when it comes to like certain issues, like humanitarian issues especially, and like issues concerning the good of the collective, I do think she's less level-headed in terms of that, like in terms of human rights sort of things. And we have kind of seen some of that. Like there is this little bit of like impulsivity, a little bit of grit there with her, right? I think that she's been like a very staunch supporter of sort of the Palestinian cause, and I know that that's kind of garnered her some criticism from like her co-stars and from like Disney and whatnot. But I think that she's very like firm on that, right? She's got very firm convictions when it comes to human rights and like just like protecting humanity and protecting people, right? It almost gives me the vibe of like maybe she's not as good at standing up for herself, she's good at standing up for others. I don't know, it kind of has that vibe to me a little bit. I do think that she like is very professional though overall. Like I do think she communicates really well with her coworkers. I think she gets along with them. And I think she's just overall like a very friendly kind of person to work with in a more professional environment. Her Mercury is in the 11th house as well, the house of friends, hopes, and wishes. This is the last thing I'll say about this Mercury here. So again, I think she has very good, meaningful conversations with her friends. I think that that's actually maybe like how she's made her friends. I think she's quite the conversationalist, and I think that like she's just very proficient in speaking, right? Just the way that she speaks is very kind, it's very warm, it's very friendly. It's very stable, right? I think that kind of garners her a lot of attention in terms of like friends, and I think she's got a good social group there. I also think that it's like, I think that her ability to kind of speak well and like talk well and articulate well is also beneficial in terms of like her career building. Like, I think that she probably maybe has sort of made friends just like organically with like a lot of kind of people in the, you know, acting sphere that can like benefit her career, right? Um, but I think that that's very much like an unintentional like effect, you know? So she has her Venus in Aries. Venus in Aries, if you know anything about astrology, you'll know that Venus naturally rules over the signs of Taurus and Libra. And the sign opposite Libra is Aries. So when a planet is occupying the opposite sign that it rules over, it's said to essentially be in something called its detriment. And this essentially means that the planet is just kind of like unfamiliar with the energy that's being expressed. So it's a little bit less harmonious, right? Like a Venus in Libra is very harmonious. It's very like good at like, you know, expressing affection in relationships. A Venus in Aries is someone who is a little bit more self-centered and a little bit more self-focused when it comes to relationships, right? It's very much like I love myself sort of vibes. Like I really love myself, you know, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But Venus and Aries people too are also often very much like impulsive in their relationship urges, and they're not necessarily like well thought out, right? If they like someone, they're just gonna like come out and like say that they like that person, right? Like it's very upfront. Like she's very like decisive, right? Like she connects with others through like this decisiveness and this like go-getter sort of attitude, right? She's definitely like totally like first move. Like she will make the first move. Like she's got no issues whatsoever with that sort of thing, right? I also wrote in my notes that I think that she's more like temperamental and like hot-headed in relationships. Like I think like her romantic partners and her like close friends probably see like a very different side to her, you know? Yeah, like I think like they just see her as like a little bit angry, you know? Like they see that side of her more. I think that the public sees her as very level-headed and very like grounded, but I think that like the people she's really close to probably get a little bit more fieriness from her, you know, if you know what I'm saying. I think too as well she's very like career driven, career focused. I don't necessarily think that she's overly concerned with like her relationships. I think that she's like really just got her attention on like building like a career, you know. I do wonder though if she is like almost like a workaholic in some ways. Like I do feel like maybe her work sometimes like interferes with her, how do I say this, her ability to like take care of herself almost and fulfill like her purpose in life. And I see this because we do have like Venus sitting right in between the nodes, so it's forming a square to both the north and the south node, which are sort of like destiny points almost, right? Like her destiny is kind of like pointing her in one direction, but her heart is pointing her in another direction. So there's some tension there. And I could imagine that that's difficult to reconcile. And then we have Mars in the sign of Sagittarius in the 6th house. So again, incredible work ethic, right? But Mars has to do with our assertion, right? And our motivation. So she asserts herself in a manner that's very dynamic with an underlying curiosity to like understand things, right? Sagittarius energy is all about deeply understanding something. There's also often like a motivation to kind of cultivate a sense of expertise in a chosen craft with Mars and Sagittarius, right? Because Sagittarius is all about, it's the sign of the devoted scholar, so it's really about going deep with like one particular area, right? She has a conjunction to Chiron with her Mars conjunct Chiron in Sagittarius. So I do feel like some of this sort of desire to like become an expert in her craft is kind of like connected to sort of this feeling of not being good enough, right? Like I think that maybe someone at some point made her feel not good enough, maybe. Like they tried to kind of undermine her talent. And she kind of strives to prove those people wrong, right? Like it's a bit of a chip on her shoulder. It doesn't necessarily have to be that someone made her feel that way. It could be that that's also just like an internal feeling that she is experiencing, right? That feeling of, oh, I'm not good enough, like I need to get better at this, I need to like become a master of this craft, right? So there's always like this sense of like striving towards something and like never quite getting there, you know? With Mars conjunct Chiron too, I also have this in my natal chart though in the sign of Scorpio, not in the sign of Sagittarius, but I do also find that there is this kind of deep compulsive urge to make sense of your trauma as well as to make sense of the healing process from on both like a physical level and a very deep spiritual level. What else to say about this birth chart? We have both Saturn and Jupiter in the sign of Gemini. So Saturn and Jupiter are kind of like opposing in some ways. Jupiter is the great expander. It's the principle of expansion and abundance and excess, right? Saturn is the opposite of that. Saturn is all about restriction. It's about constricting. It's about those experiences that maybe make you feel not as good, sort of. So they kind of work hand in hand, right? You have expansion and restriction, and it's kind of nice when they're in the same sign because they kind of help to balance each other out when they're in the same sign. But Saturn and Jupiter in the same sign typically indicates a sense of steady growth, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be put in order to see any sort of abundance flow through, right? And there's never really, it doesn't ever feel like there's necessarily an excess. It feels very much with Saturn and Jupiter in the same sign, it feels very much like the work that you put in is like what you get out, kind of, right? That being said, they are occupying different house positions. We have Jupiter in Gemini in the 12th house. Jupiter in the 12th house is often said to be like a guardian angel placement. Like it's almost like a person has someone kind of watching out for them on the other side, like sort of like making sure that like nothing bad happens to them. And Jupiter in the 12th house, to me, it really is all about, with this placement, it's really all about this like sense of the abundant universe. Like there's this deep desire to want to connect to universal consciousness, right? The 12th house has to do, again, with all those sort of mystical themes, those spiritual themes. It's interesting too because the 12th house is also, you know, even though again it can be quite lovely, mysticism, spirituality, like blah blah blah, all this stuff, like it seems very nice, but the 12th house is also the house of personal undoings. And sometimes when I see Jupiter here, on the one hand, yes, there is like this burning sort of like sensation of like, oh, I want to be connected to like the broader universe and like be one with the universe and all this like lovely stuff. But then there's also like this, there's also like, I do think that like some people with this placement might feel like cut off almost from their ability to like be like optimistic and expansive in their experiences, right? There's sort of like this shrinking, or it always feels like you're cut off from your joy, sort of. At least that's how I see it with like Jupiter in the 12th house, and there's kind of like this need to like sort of delve into the more shadowy aspects of the self, the repressed aspects of the self, the like trauma, and also all the spiritual things, right? Like the spiritual healing that you need to do in order to like access this joy. That's what I would say with this Jupiter. It is a Jupiter in Gemini too, which I will say Jupiter is also in its detriment in the sign of Gemini because Jupiter naturally rules over Sagittarius, and Sagittarius and Gemini are opposites. So when Jupiter is in Gemini, it's in its detriment. And so Jupiter in Gemini is someone who like, it's someone who like really wants to kind of like do everything, right? It's like, I want a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this. It's like very much someone who's a jack of all trades. So it kind of contrasts with all of her like Sagittarius placements, like her Mars in Sagittarius, Chiron in Sagittarius, Pluto in Sagittarius, right? So she's kind of like fighting this battle between like, on the one hand, like wanting to become a master at a particular craft and that being like very intimately connected to like trauma and like just the way that she views herself. But then there's also like this sort of like wanting to like just dip her toes into everything on the other hand, right? So it's like wanting to become a master of one thing versus like wanting to do everything, you know? It's very confusing. And then Saturn, her Saturn is in the 11th house. Saturn is also often like, even though it's the planet of constriction and like constraint and like boundaries and all of that like stuff that like people hate, Saturn is also associated with like maturity and mastery of over a certain thing, right? So with her Saturn in Gemini, right, she really is like a master of communication. What's interesting too to me is Saturn can also sometimes be seen as like the father figure in astrology, almost like the father archetype. So I do like wonder also if her dad was like really maybe like into writing, or maybe he was like into poetry or something like that, or maybe he was like a scholarly sort, like a professor of some kind potentially. With it being in the 11th house too, again, I think she's good at making friends. I think that she's kind of like a master of networking almost. Like I think that she's very good at networking. And again, that is very beneficial for her career. Like she's good at making connections with people and meeting new people, and then that kind of leads into her like ability to like pursue her desires and her dream sort of career path, right? So now moving on a little bit to the outer planets. The outer planets, the sign placement typically doesn't matter with the outer planets because they're said to be generational influences. So they occupy a specific sign for like many, many, many years, sometimes even like decades, right? So typically people within a generation will all have the same sign placement, right? Like they'll have their Uranus in Aquarius, they'll have their Neptune in Aquarius, and they'll have their Pluto in Sagittarius. So like I was born, for example, like a couple years before her. Crazy. But I also have my Neptune in Aquarius, my Uranus in Aquarius, and my Pluto in Sagittarius. So I have all the same sign placements of the outer planets that she does. So really long-winded way of saying that the sign placements of the outer planets don't really matter that much when you're doing like an individual chart reading, because like the entire generation has those planets in the same sign. But the house placement, on the other hand, is a little bit more specific. So we are going to get into that. She has her Uranus in Aquarius in the 8th house. Uranus is sort of said to be like the first, it's said to be the first stage of like, it's kind of like representative of a spiritual awakening almost. It's like that awakening influence, right? It's that those sort of sudden breakthroughs, sudden realizations, right? It's in the 8th house, which is the house of death. It almost makes me wonder, it seems very accident prone to me almost. Like I wonder if like someone in her family like got into an accident, got injured, or maybe even passed away sort of thing. Like I wonder if she's had really sort of like abrupt experiences with death, like maybe like people or pets perhaps have like passed away rather suddenly. And I think that those experiences, though, that kind of like allow her this window into sort of heightened awareness, right? Sort of, it kind of like allows her to kind of get into that spiritual side of things, right? Because the 8th house, again, it's about death, but it's like death is just a process of transmuting things, right? It's like a transmutation process, right? And when we die, or when we see others die, then we become more in tune with this transmutation process, and it kind of leads us into becoming more spiritually aware and more appreciative of life, right? And that's very much the case for her too, because she also has her Neptune in the 8th house, right? Uranus is like that initial awakening, and then Neptune is that level above, right? Where we're going from having some sort of awakening experience to now we're kind of experiencing some sort of heightened perceptual awareness, some sort of expanded state of consciousness where we're more in tune with what's around us, the energy around us, the environment around us, right? There's like a dissolution of self with Neptune, right? Where you feel more at one and at peace with things. There is also too, though, Neptune can also kind of manifest more as like delusion and like escapism, right? And so it's got that kind of dual, there's that dual tendency of like, where's the line exactly between escapism versus like transcendence, right? It's like, what's the difference between someone who's like very delusional and very like out of touch and someone who is like a spiritual master, right? What's the difference between those two? And typically some astrologers would argue it's in how grounded you are, and I do think she's fairly grounded. So there's that. But again, it's in the 8th house, so there's that theme of death coming up again, right? Of this idea of transcending through death. I think that when you have Neptune in the 8th house, or if you have your 8th house in Pisces, like I do, there's also this like idealization of death almost, where you're like, oh, death is this like transformative, beautiful experience, right? Like it's just this beautiful part of life where you're able to kind of just see death like very in this very like almost just like, yeah, it's just, I don't even know how to describe it, but you're able to just, it's kind of like you got the rose colored glasses on, I guess, when it comes to death, you know? Yeah. I don't know. I definitely do with these placements in her chart, with like the 12th house placements and the 8th house placements. It does make me feel like she is very like spiritually connected though. Like I definitely think that there's something there. I don't know really if she is into any of that sort of stuff like I am, but it's definitely, she could definitely be a witch for sure. That's very certain, or like a medium of some kind. Okay, so I'm going to, because Stephen Arroyo is very much better able to articulate things than I am, so I'm going to read off just, I do really like what he says in this book about like Pluto. And some of the outer planets. So he talks about the house placements of Pluto. She has her Pluto in the 6th house. So Pluto in the 6th house. Here in the 6th house, Pluto indicates someone who either wants to serve and help others, or at least wants to feel as if he or she is a helpful person. There can be a compulsion to serve others, often in ways that are not appreciated by those being served. This person will often do best to work by and with himself, directing his reformative energies towards his own personal transformation. This position of Pluto also indicates that matters of personal health or a particular serious illness can be instrumental in producing great changes in one's attitudes and a purification of one's values. In some cases, it also seems to indicate talent in the healing arts. Very interesting. There is a lot of those themes as well. She also, I will mention too, as like kind of like wrapping up here, she does have her midhaven in Pisces too. Pisces again is all about healing. It's also all about humanity and service to humanity. The midhaven is one of the angles in the chart, much like the ascendant, and it's said to represent kind of like our true calling. The midhaven is kind of like what we're reaching up towards and what we're aiming for in this lifetime. So with a Pisces midhaven, there is this need to be of service to humanity and the wider collective, right? And to be sort of like a peacekeeper and a peacemaker of sorts. And that's interesting too, because what I said earlier was that she gives me the vibe of someone like Jane Fonda, like sort of like this actor turned activist type, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see, to just follow her career and like see where she goes with that. I think the last thing I'll mention though is the nodes, which I mentioned very briefly before. She's got her south node in Capricorn and her north node in Pisces. And they are right on the angles, like the descendant ascendant too. I also have this in my chart. Interesting. So yeah, I think that she intuitively knows where she's going. A south node in Capricorn is someone who typically earlier on in life was very mature for their age. They had to take on a lot of responsibilities growing up, probably. Or that could also be the case in a past life. If you believe in past life, is it someone who kind of had to take on a lot in a past life, right? And who had to really learn how to put in the work, you know, someone who worked very, very hard. But then as she's gotten older and as she continues to grow, she's going to move a little bit more into that Cancer North Node. And Cancer is all about, you know, fostering very deep connections with others. It's that self-protectiveness, it's that introversion, it's that very contained sense of belonging, right? So she's moving from a little bit more of like a harsher energy into like a little bit more of a softer energy, right? But the nodes too are also about balance, right? So it's about, for her, it's about balancing work as well as balancing her ability to take care of herself and to take care of her close relationships, right? So there's a balance there that needs to be learned and cultivated. So I think that that's all for this chart analysis. If you know anything more about Rachel Zegler, let me know. I usually don't really like looking into the people whose charts I do because I kind of just like to like see how accurate it was. Usually there's people in the comments sometimes that tell me like, oh yeah, I follow this person really closely and I like, this was actually pretty accurate, blah, 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 you know. So if you know anything about Rachel Zegler and like the work that she does, if you've been following her for a while, maybe leave me a comment. Let me know how accurate this chart reading was. And I'll see you in the next video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You can also check out my website. If you would like to book a reading with me, you can also find me on Instagram and I will respond to DMs on Instagram. So yeah. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you soon.